and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. The InfoQ podcast is a software engineering podcast brought to you by the team behind InfoQ.com, a software engineering news site which aims to help progressive software development teams adopt new technologies. We're also the people behind the international software conference QCon. I'm Richard Seroter, and I was at the Agile Alliance Technical Conference chatting with some of the presenters and organizers. In this round of interviews, we're talking to James Shore, who presented on Agile Engineering for the Web, Llewellyn Falco, who talked about code smells in an intriguing session, and Rebecca Wirfs-Brock, who presented a session on being agile with architecture qualities. This is Richard Seroter with InfoQ at the Agile Alliance Technical Conference with James, and do you want to introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah, I'm James Shore. I have a screencast called Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. I wrote a book called The Art of Agile Development, and my day job is as a consultant for entrepreneurial companies working on large-scale agile systems.
Can you describe a little bit of your talk yesterday? I got to attend it and thought it was an interesting look at front-end testing. Can you describe kind of what you wanted to cover there and where you think that's maybe an underserved area?
Yeah, the talk was about Agile Engineering for the Web, and it was about how do you bring typical Agile engineering ideas like test-driven development and refactoring to the front-end languages, front-end JavaScript, the DOM, HTML, and CSS. And I think it's an interesting talk because a lot of people know how to do these things, although not everybody actually does them. On the back end, with .NET, with Java, with Python, with Ruby, with Rails, they know how to do test-driven development and refactor their code on the back end. They even know how to do it with Node.js on the back end. But once you get to the front end and you start working with the DOM and the browser and touch events and mouse events and so forth, a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, this is JavaScript, it's crap, I'm not going to do anything. And then you end up with situations like I run into all the time where they're developing on Chrome and I use Firefox, and there are some pretty massive bugs. And for smaller sites, there are times when I cannot see their project unless I run Chrome. Even on larger sites, I see CSS bugs all the time, because it's very hard to refactor CSS without breaking something. CSS is probably the quirkiest language that's in widespread use right now, I would say.
Yeah.
So the talk was about, well, how do you do test-driven development and refactoring in front-end JavaScript when you're dealing with the DOM, and with CSS when you're dealing with visual things.
Yeah, it was interesting too. You spun up obviously a lot of different interfaces, whether it's using, as you run a test, you're testing Android, you're testing iOS, you're testing web.
Yeah.
You feel like the tools have gotten to a point where that can be fairly seamlessly integrated into your test cycle?
Absolutely. The JavaScript world is very fad-driven, unfortunately. So people will abandon things that work well in favor of stuff that's newer and shinier. So one tool that has been around for quite a while, it's not perfect, but it's very good, will allow you to test your code on any browser that you can connect to your network. And in that example, I had iOS, I had Android emulator, the iOS simulator, IE running in a VM, as well as Safari, Chrome, and Firefox. But I've used Karma with a real iPad connected to my network. I've used it with a Amazon Fire device, Kindle Fire, just to see if I could, and what it does is it allows you to write tests that are shipped over the network to the actual browser, run in the real browser so you can see real behavior and validate your results.
Yes, one thing you were showing is obviously going very small in your test. It wasn't I wasn't going to write these massive tests. You're adding an element to a style to an element. You're doing things like that. What kind of guidance do you give it? Do you give different guidance for the front end versus doing back end test driven, or you follow the same sort of principles?
No, the basics of test driven development are the same either way. People call it red green refactor. I like to add think at the beginning, and it's basically, regardless of where you are, you're going to be doing the same thing. You're thinking about what do I want to develop next? What's some small test that will help me get there by failing until I've written that small thing. And when I say small, I mean less than 5 lines of code. And I think that's really something that distinguishes experts in TDD from people new to TDD, is the experts are capable of going smaller, which is a skill that takes time to develop. And then, so you think of what you're going to write. You write that test, you watch it fail, that's the red. You write the production code, a couple lines of code, make it pass, that's the green, and then you refactor until it's as good as you know how to make it right now, and then you repeat. And you're doing this, a couple dozen times an hour, maybe 30 seconds through the loop when you're not running into problems, a couple minutes when you are, and just chugging along. And it goes very smoothly and very quickly when you're doing it well. I find that when I do TDD in these small steps, when I make a mistake, and don't get me wrong, I make mistakes all the time. When I make a mistake, the amount of things that I've changed are so small that I can look at the code and see it pretty much instantly just by inspection. And when I can't, I undo the 2 lines of code I just wrote and do them again because there's something dumb I'm not seeing, and the second time usually works out. Very rarely have to open up a debugger working in this way.
And you see it the same, obviously, with local devs doing this locally. Then it's part of a CI process as well that runs through the whole process. Is that how you typically see this step through?
Yeah, absolutely. You want, in a high-performance team that really knows what they're doing, they'll have the ability to run everything on their local development environment.
Sure.
You want to get feedback. When you're doing TDD, you need to get feedback from whether or not the last couple of lines you wrote are doing what you thought they were going to do, either making the test fail in exactly the way you thought the test was going to fail or making the test pass. You want to get confirmation on that in less than 5 seconds, which means that everything has to be run locally. Now, there is a need for some more intensive testing, especially if you're doing like a large mainstream site and you're supporting all kinds of wacky browsers. You might not test all those browsers on your local development machine, but I will frequently run my tests and get them to tell me an answer in less than 5 seconds while testing against 5 to 10 browsers on my local development machine. And I got to tell you, my computer is 4 years old, so I do have an SSD, but...
Are there front-end tests that are still hard to perform based on user behavior? Are there certain activities that you look at and go, boy, it's still hard to mock that up? Or do you feel like you've got good coverage at this point where most things the user can do, you can script out, you can put into a test?
Oh, there's definitely things that have been really hard for me to figure out. That's part of why I started my screencast, Let's Code JavaScript. But so, for example, touch events. It turns out that in order to test something like touch events or mouse events, you have to create simulated events and feed them to the browser. And the way you do that with touch events is by creating a touch event and then telling the browser that you're going to dispatch it. The init touch event method exists on both Android and iOS. However, the parameters, although they are exactly the same, are in different orders depending on which browser you're on. So, that's something that we did in the screencast and spent some time working through, but now I know how to do it. And once you know how to do it, it's easy. That's true for pretty much everything with TDD. In a new domain, a new problem domain, it can be difficult to figure out. For example, I developed a library, Quixote, for testing CSS. Until that was done, it was really hard to test CSS. Now it's not that hard. And that's one of the things I was demonstrating. So yeah, sometimes it can take a little while to figure it out. But if the person can do it, generally a computer can do it. But getting there can be a bit challenge.
So this conference as a whole, you've been part of the Agile conferences in the past, I believe.
I've been involved with the Agile community since 2000. I've been part of the community. I've been doing Agile stuff since 1999. So yeah, I've been around for a while.
Yeah, so what did you think of this conference being the first time? What you did this time, would you have done at a traditional Agile annual conference?
It's interesting that you ask. In the early days of Agile, so the very first U.S. Agile conference was XP Universe. I believe it was here in Raleigh, and I believe it was in 2001. And I was at that conference, and I presented at that conference. In the early days of Agile, it was a sort of a programmer grassroots movement. And there was a lot of, as it grew and became more popular, there was a lot of demand to make it a bigger tent, bring in people who weren't programmers. And so project managers were brought in, and business analysts and testers, and it really grew and grew and grew and grew. And as it became more popular, the Scrum methodology became very popular, but it has less of an emphasis on technical practices. And so the main Agile conference sort of shifted in that direction, which was a good thing. And in the process, I think a lot of the technical folks got disillusioned, and they sort of dropped out. And once you lose an audience, it's hard to bring them back because you can't put sessions on for people who aren't there, but if you don't put on sessions that people are going to be interested in, you can't get them back. So I'm really pleased to see the Agile Alliance putting on this technical conference, getting topic, we do develop software in Agile, most of us do, that's certainly what I do, and it is about software development, and if you don't think about how you're developing software, you're not going to succeed. Agile cannot work without technical engineering practices behind it. So I'm really pleased to see them putting this conference on, and I think the ideal end state would be the two conferences merging back together and getting back to that big tent where we have cross-functional groups talking about cross-functional ideas.
Sure. Last question, anything that stood out to you in a session you attended this time, something you felt like you learned that was interesting or something that inspired you to do anything different or just thought it was intellectually stimulating?
Yeah, I just came out of a session with Llewellyn Falco that I thought was just fantastic. Where he talked about code smells, and he had this great training technique to teach your brain how to recognize code smells, which involved flashing slides up on the screen and then telling you what category they were in. For those of you reading this or listening to this out there, if you have a chance to see Llewellyn do this talk, I highly recommend it. And I also find that learning to identify bad code or smells in code is a really tricky skill. And I think he did an excellent job on it. So I'm going to steal his stuff and use it myself. He said he would make it available publicly. So
awesome.
Yeah, it was good stuff.
Well, good. Thanks, James. I appreciate you doing the interview with us.
Thank you.
This is Richard Seroter with InfoQ interviewing Llewellyn. Do you want to introduce yourself and what you do?
Hi, I'm Llewellyn Falco. I do a bunch of different things. I'm a creator of an open source project called ApprovalTests, and I care a lot about testing. I'm an Agile coach, and I sit with teams, and we do technical practices. So we sit with the code, and we actually do a lot of refactoring and a lot of testing, and we learn to be better programmers. And then I also co-founder of a project called Teaching Kids Programming. We teach kids, usually age 10s and up, to program in Java, which it turns out is a surprisingly good environment to learn to program in. And I do all of those things.
Awesome. So we're here at the Agile Alliance Technical Conference. Tell us a little bit about what your session was what was the point of your session? What were you trying to get across to the attendees?
So I've stumbled across this technique, brought a lot of times from Kathy Sierra, who wrote the Head First series, wonderful teacher. And she looked at this way of teaching not your conscious brain, but your subconscious to sort of recognize things. A lot of times things that you don't even exactly know why, right? And I really like that idea of how do you train style? Because style is so important, right? What people have a good sense of, this is a good idea, or this is a good design, or this is good code. And they do it through these rapid series of really good examples. And by good examples doesn't necessarily mean the example is good code, but that it's clear what is good or what is bad. And you get these examples, and your brain just pattern matches. It's very similar to the way you do artificial intelligence training. You get a training set and you give it to the computer and you just sort of say, figure it out. And that works great with artificial intelligence or AI, but it turns out it also works great with I. Give it to just an intelligent being and they can start to figure out stuff even if they don't necessarily know why. And I was finding there was a lot of people who, it wasn't just that they didn't do good coding practices, they didn't even realize that the code they had wasn't good, right? You'd look at it and say, what's wrong with this? And at best you might get, well, it's not good, right? But you wouldn't get oh, it's too long, or that's cluttered, or there's too much duplication. And if you don't know what's wrong, you don't know how to fix it. And that's an important journey. It's a long journey. But I needed to deal with the thing right before that, which is, how do I know what it is? And how do I condense what can be years of experience to a very short thing? So when Kathy started talking about this, I really wanted to try it. And fortunately, there's these wonderful conferences where they'll do things called open spaces. And in open space, you can do sessions that you don't know the answer to. And so one person said, I'll be your code monkey, or your test monkey, come try something with me. And I was like, okay. And so I was like, I really want to try this thing. And he was good at birds. He was a bird watcher. So I said, okay, teach me about birds. And he went to Google and he got a whole bunch of pictures of house sparrows and a whole bunch of pictures of song sparrows. And he put them on the projector. I'd close my eyes. He would put up a bird. And then I would try to guess what it was. And then he would tell me if I was right. And this took about 40 seconds a bird. But at about 15, 20 minutes, by the time I was opening up my eyes and the bird was coming into focus, I knew the answer. And I did not need him to confirm it. I knew in my gut, that's a house sparrow. And And so I started saying like, okay, well let's see if we can do something with that. And that was about a year ago now. I've made my first PowerPoint decks out of the birds, but of course birds are only academically interesting, I think. And so then we started doing things around code smells and other things related to programming. At this one I did 6 code smells, the 6 most common I see. The clutter, code has clutter in it all over the place. Long lines that go way off the screen, can't tell. Long methods that go for hundreds of thousands of lines sometimes. Duplication and inconsistency. Those are the 6 that I see, and so I trained everyone who was in the room by running through these decks, and hopefully when they go back to their code, they will start saying, oh, what's wrong with that? Now, there's still a long journey between that's not right to how I fix it.
Right.
But hopefully now they're going to start that journey.
So was the point out of it that they were able to spot what was bad, or were you also showing them positive cases where they were seeing the opposite of clutter or the opposite of
So you show both,
line?
right? So you show clutter, but the thing is relevant. So the opposite of the smell is not necessarily good, right? It's just not that smell, right? And because, so this was a 45-minute talk, and I showed 965 slides. So these things take a long time to put together.
Right.
And there's actually a GitHub project out there that I wrote to compile the PowerPoint because they take a really long time to put together otherwise, but they still take a long time. And so a lot of times I would grab code and things that are out there. So I didn't necessarily try to focus on good code. And I didn't want, because there's 6 decks, if I always did perfect code, it would just be smell versus good code. So I tried to do smell versus code that doesn't have the smell. And in fact, at the very last one, when we get to inconsistency, I didn't even do inconsistency versus consistent. I ended up doing inconsistency versus duplication, because unfortunately, when you have something that's inconsistently done in multiple places and you clean it up, you end up in duplication, right? And it seems like that's almost the flip side. Inconsistent but duplicated is different than just a whole bunch of unrelated stuff.
So do you think that, you mentioned the kids who code aspect of that, is there an age where an age of programmer could be a 50-year-old new programmer, but do you see that this is something that's better to apply to someone early on in their programming experience, or is it an old dog's new tricks scenario where anybody could start to recognize what they've been doing wrong?
So one of the neat things about it is at the beginning, when you see the sparrow for the first time, you've never seen one and you're an utter noob.
Right.
And then 3.5 minutes later, you can recognize it within 3/4 of a second of it flashing on your screen, and you're an expert. And the nice thing about that is you are not instilling a whole bunch of bad habits. So I think earlier is better, because later means I now have to untrain habits. We do actually have sparrow decks with the kids stuff. Now they're much smaller decks and they're much more focused. So for example, in the very, very first lesson, we introduced for loops. And we have a deck on for loops. It's about 33 examples. And the thing is, if you wrote a program a day that had a for loop, we are now over a month out of experience at 17 minutes into to programming. And we just found that it just makes it a lot easier. And just like the sparrows, like some people are like, well, it's the feathers, or some people do the beak, some people like the shape of the body, right? There's all these different things. But the thing is, I could take all those things and put it on a bird that is not a sparrow, and they'd still say, but that's not a sparrow.
Right.
And so there's these other much more fuzzy things that are coming around the thing. And it's the same with the for loops. Like the deck that we do for the for loops, first it just has empty things. There's how many times to do it. Well, it does it 6 times, it does it 9 times. You can match just on a single number. Then we do for loops side by side. So 10, 10, well, that's 20. And then we do embedded, so 10 of 5, well, that's 50. But you take away more than that, because these other patterns start to go, and you start to realize the curly braces matter, and you start to realize there's 3 parts, and if there isn't, you might not know what's right, but you know it's wrong, and that again
helps.
Yeah, it's that sense of style. Hey, this isn't right.
Yeah.
I might not be able to put my finger on it, but I know it's not.
It smells.
Yeah.
So last question for you is, anything that stood out to you at the conference in another session? Do you feel like you came here and picked up something that you didn't know before, just something that kind of percolated in your head?
So the thing that stood out to me the most was the audience. In multiple sessions, there were lots of quotings of papers or researches or ideas, and almost in all those times, that person was in the audience, right? Lori did a great thing on pair programming, and 5 or 6 of the references were there. There was a refactoring session, and again, like 7 or 8 of the quotes came from people in the audience. It was amazing. And it allows for conversations in the hallway that you don't get at other places. I really enjoyed that.
That's awesome. Hey, thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Absolutely.
This is Richard Seroter. I'm at the Agile Alliance Technical Conference with Rebecca. Introduce yourself and what you do for a living.
I'm Rebecca Wirfs-Brock, and I'm known for having invented responsibility-driven design, and which became the meme for XDD, whatever-driven, TDD, DDD, domain-driven design. But these days, I'm a consultant and coach in design and architecture, working both with agile teams as well as more traditional organizations.
So tell me about your talk. I got to attend it, which was interesting and exciting. But recap for this audience, kind of what your thesis was and what you were talking through.
Well, so the main gist of the idea was that in our rush in an agile world to deliver features, sometimes the architectural work that we need to do to deliver features that work the way we want, that are usable, that are performable, scalable, kind of get slighted. So how do we make, in an agile way, the architectural work visible and not ignore it? Yeah.
And you talked about a few different models, I recall. There was the zipper model, there's skeleton. I mean, there's a few different ways that you could tackle that. So how do you see teams approaching that reality then?
Well, again, one of the things that, you could do, it depends on what kind of project it is and size. Maybe I don't have a lot of architectural concerns because I'm doing something fairly simple. Well, then fine, use your standard stack, do it, go, On the other hand, oftentimes I see where people get in trouble is when they're on larger programs and connecting with other pieces of the system, or that infrastructure needs to be explored. Hey, they've got to think about not just having the architecture emerge, hoping that I do it right before I do the feature, but it might take a little more planning and organization. And also to go into monitoring it on my daily rhythms rather than just saying, oh, it's just there. So ways of making the architectural qualities that I want visible, even to the point of one of the things I talked about in the talk was having, I may implement a story, a functional story, and then I may say, well, fine, that we get good feedback that works, but now what are the fold-out system qualities that I want to have it done with the qualities I need to really put it into production? So there's just, once you get that mindset that if I need to do it, I need to make it explicit, but I don't have to do it in the, I'm going to say, heavy-handed way that says, I deliver it to you, you're going to do it, that it's a collaborative effort that delivers the system functionality along with the architectural work you need.
How do you get past that mindset change of big upfront design and architecture that kind of comes down from on high, as you mentioned, and you go implement that because somehow you foresaw all the architectural qualities up front before any coding happened? How do you start to make that transition if you're working with that traditional company who sees architecture and development and operations as very distinct disciplines?
Well, you don't just blow everything up all at once. And in fact, I think, the whole team concept that Agile is really all about, when we first started, DevOps weren't together, right? And now we're getting to the dev team and deployment team kind of understand. We also, and there's having been involved in the Agile Experience Report program, there's been embedding QA rather than having it being separate and distinct. And in the other case of architecture work, it's not that you want to throw away architecture or big term, long term planning, but you need to have a mind shift that I need to have sustainability and follow through, not just delivery of the architecture and there you go. And that requires a change in accepting that the whole team includes someone with that mindset, right? Now, they may not be working full-time on your project if they're an enterprise, but they're part of the team. And so you have to work on trust, relationships, and the fact that in traditional architecture, it's been the case, sadly, that I hand it off to them, and then the development and IT infrastructure teams say, well, they didn't know, we were disconnected. It's the handoff and not getting the feedback. You got to be part of the team. And so it's not like it's us and them. And that takes, people that say, this is how we're going to work.
So your idea of, and what you talked about with, again, emergent architecture, and this idea that you might start off with just the basics, or you might just be kind of a slice through all of the core illities that you have to cover without fleshing all of them out. How do you, again, make people feel more confident that doing refactoring from architecture perspective is not a bad thing, or that you don't feel like you need to do all that upfront design work? I like the idea of refactoring your architecture and kind of building it up from a base skeleton model, but how do you start to convince people that everything's going to be okay?
Well, so if there are very high risky things that you need to go do, they may not be on this incremental, very fast path, all right? So it's not that all architecture emerges at the same pace. And so if I know something is very highly risky, it's okay to take it off and do bounded architectural explorations, but like any other kind of activity, needs to be bounded and measurable results. One of the questions that came up during my talk was, well, how do you have an incremental architecture like that and get measurements? Well, if I say to you, I'm going to go away for 6 months and go figure this out, that's not very measurable. But if I can say, here's an increment of time that I think I'm going to figure out this, then we reassess whether we need to do more. That allows you to have these longer term things, not just go freewheeling. And then, doing it in a vacuum is really bad. The whole thing about Agile is that it's a collaborative whole team effort. So if we have the architects in the back room doing the stuff and then handing it to people, that doesn't really work. So engaging teams, maybe getting dev teams working with architects, if they're doing some of this exploration, just like having QA sit with developers. It's the new world. It's a collaborative world.
Yeah, so last question is, what did you think of the conference as a whole? I mean, obviously it's the first time doing a sort of technical conference. Do you think we're finished now for those who are listening to the recording, but did it accomplish its goal from your perspective? Did this serve a need that wasn't being served by the greater Agile Alliance conference?
Well, I think it did for two reasons. The size, so all this technical stuff wasn't lost in this huge morass of other stuff. So we had intimate conversations with a smaller set of people. So not that 3,000 person conferences are a bad idea, but it allowed people with similar interests and passions to get together. So that was good. But then it's a good blend of technical thoughts and technology talks. So that was kind of nice. I'm happy as a clam.
Yeah. Did anything stand out to you from a session you attended? Or something you walk away with that you think about?
There's so many sessions that it's really hard to say, picking out which thing really made me, there were just a lot of stimulating thoughts. And in some sense, I enjoyed the live demo kind of things that I saw. Talking about testing assumptions, Justin Searles that was actually really pretty awesome. And so I'm going to have an ongoing conversation with him just because how much do we test? Are we, testing in and of itself for coverage is not the message, but what are we testing? Assumptions about how much we need to really integration test, but what do we need to test? That one particularly got my attention.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate you getting a chance to chat with us.